Hey, I'm Tim and welcome back to the Georgia Workshop. Today I'm going to show you how I make these custom leather patch hats with my logo on it. And full disclosure, this is not my method. I got my inspiration from Chris Zepp with Make Everything Shop. He's the first person I saw that actually did this, so I want to make sure I give him the credit he is due. Please, I'm going to link his video up here somewhere as well as down in the description. Please give him a look, a like, subscribe. He makes some really cool stuff, and he deserves the credit for inspiring me to make these hats. I also want to throw a quick shout out to Ethan Carter with Ethan Carter Designs. I'm going to link him down below too. He helped me out with advice on some of the tools I use and some of the techniques when it came to working with the leather, so give him a check as well. That's enough of me running my mouth. Let's get into it and make some hats. Alright, so the first step in making the patches is to actually cut the circles out of this sheet of leather. And big thanks to Ethan Carter for recommending this cutter, because prior to this I had tried using the X-Acto knife, I had tried using a bandsaw, and nothing compares to this little cutter. It took a little while to get it dialed in, but once I got the blade to the right height, I breezed right through cutting all 25 of these patches out. Alright, so at this point all the circles are cut and I'm ready to actually start the embossing. There you can see I'm using my budget branding iron to emboss my logo onto the leather. It just, it seemed to make sense. I tried it out previously and it worked really well. So I take the individual patch, I soak it in a little bit of water, I line up the branding iron to make sure I have an even reveal all the way around, and then I use my bench vise to apply pressure on the bottom. It does a great job of holding it in place so nothing moves, as well as provide that pressure. And then from there, along the top, I put 2 of my 6-inch F-style clamps to even out that pressure, to make sure I get a nice even squeeze on the top and bottom to get an even emboss on here. And just a second, you'll see exactly what that looks like. Okay, and through the magic of editing, 10 minutes goes by in 1 second, and we're ready to start taking these clamps off and see how this first patch came out. What you'll notice is I got a good, crisp, clean emboss with the logo, but as I zoom in, you'll notice that there are light and dark spots, and that's just because I didn't soak it long enough in the water. Going forward, I made sure to soak each piece of leather a little bit longer to ensure I got a really even and crisp emboss. From here we get into the rinse and repeat part of the process. I ultimately made about 25 of these patches, and at 10 minutes a piece it took just over 4 hours. But don't worry, I won't make you sit through all of that. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm actually trying to dial in the tone of the leather that we wanted. You can see in the front there, there's the original patch we did with the medium brown leather dye, which was just too dark, and the one just to the left of it is the light brown leather dye, which was much closer to what we were looking for, but still a little too dark. So what I decided to do was run some tests by, I put 5 pipettes of light brown leather dye in this test cup here, and to the left there you see a was clear, now it's a stained cup of denatured alcohol. What I'm doing is I'm adding 1 pipette at a time to basically lighten the light brown leather dye by about 20% each time I add 1 pipette. It's not a very scientific method, but it was a way for me to measure the exact ratio of alcohol to dye that I ended up with. I ran 5 tests, lightening it up to basically get to a point where I was at a 50-50 dye to alcohol blend, and that's the one my wife and I liked the best. You'll see it on the far left there, and that's where we ultimately went with the rest of these patches. Okay, and now that we've got the right blend that we liked for the actual dye, it's time to enter another rinse and repeat portion where we go through and individually dye all 25 of these patches. You see about 22 there in front of you, but I ended up by doing about 25, and a couple of those we did with a black leather dye because we wanted to experiment to see how those would look as well. So now there's definitely a skill involved with applying this dye and getting it even. You'll see some of these are a little blotchy. Some of that has to do with how dry the leather was. I let everything dry overnight, but some were a little damp in some areas and some weren't. Some were drier, some were pressed differently, and so there's definitely a bit of a skill involved with getting the leather dye even across the entire patch. But we kind of like the look, the rustic kind of handmade look. It shows that these were not cranked out by a machine. These were individually handmade, and we kind of like that. And here I'm coming up on the end of the dyeing process, and I use that Q-tip to touch up the edges as well as apply extra dye to some of the lighter areas that needed it. But like I said, we really liked that rustic handmade look that we ended up with at the end of this, where light and dark tones kind of came together to give it an aged and worn look. Like I said, we were really happy with the way these came out, and then I also tried a couple with black dye to see how those looked, and we really liked those as well. And here's one of our finished patches, and like I said, we're really happy with the way these came out. I gave all the patches several hours to dry, and because the dye is an alcohol based, they cured really quick. And then I just went through and I applied some paste wax to the edges and to the face, and just use it to buff the logos a little bit and give them just a little bit of more of an aged feel. On the edges, I applied the paste wax because it would allow me to then burnish those edges and kind of round them over so they didn't fray or peel back at all. Okay, and here I'm using my homemade burnisher, which is just a dowel I chucked up in my drill press. I carved a little notch into it, sanded it smooth, and charred it with my torch just to use it to help to roll over and burnish that edge on these patches. Leather can be kind of fragile on the edges, and it can peel back very easily if you're not careful. So by burnishing and rolling these edges over and making them nice and smooth, polished, it helps to protect that edge and make it a much more durable finish. Time has come to start putting together my hats. I've got a bunch of these Richardson 112 trucker hats, some leather and suede glue, and some Starbond CA glue. That's going to allow me to glue the patches right to the hat. This will be for the strength, and this is kind of like a liquid clamp. It's going to hold it on while the leather and suede glue cures. I've got all of my patches over here. These have been, if you've been watching up to this point, you see that these have been cut, embossed, then leather dyed, and then I burnished the edges. And I used my the dowel as almost a little planishing rod just to give them an initial curve so that they'll be much easier to put onto the hat than they would be if they were not already kind of pre-curved. So we're going to see how this goes. From here I kind of get into the production mode of gluing the patches onto the hats, and I apply the leather and suede glue pretty liberally to the back of the patch, spread it around with that popsicle stick, and I try to stay away from the edges as much as possible because you don't want this to seep out and get on the hat. It will be visible. It's not something you can just wipe off, but if you catch it quick enough, you can scrape it off with an X-Acto knife, which you'll see me do here in a minute. But once I get the leather and suede glue applied, I apply a thin layer of CA glue around that edge, and then I press the patch onto the hat. I use the palm of my left hand and the fingers of my right to press it on really good and tight until that CA glue cures. From there, the CA glue will hold it in place while the leather and suede glue fully cures, and that's where you get your strength from. That leather and suede glue is really a pretty permanent bond. One of the hats I messed up. I put way too much CA glue and it ran out, and so when it was all fully cured, I decided to test it and yank the patch off, and it took quite a bit, and that hat was destroyed when I pulled the patch off. So it is definitely a permanent bond. But like I said, I'm not gonna make you sit through watching me do all 23 of these hats, so we'll skip ahead. yeah, I've got a lot of hats to finish making. As you can see, I've still got all of these to finish. But they're coming out pretty good. Like I said, the patch started as raw leather. I cut it, embossed it, dyed it, and now I'm affixing them to these hats. And you know, there's things I like, things I don't, things I could be happier with. But it's a learning process, and every one of these gets a little bit better. All right, so that's going to wrap this one up. It was a long process, but I had a blast making these hats. And the best part is I now get to retire this guy and replace it with one of these. Anyway, so like I said, it was a long process, but I had a really good time making these hats. Let me just pause a second and explain that that noise you just heard was my water heater, because for some reason it decided to take this exact opportunity to fill the tank and interrupt my outro. So I'm going to go ahead and rewind and then get back to the video. I had a really good time making these hats, and all said and done, I ended up with about 20 hats. I got mine, my son took his, I've got one had to be thrown away, and so I've got about 20 left. Now some of these are spoken for by family, but the rest are going to be up for sale on my website. Yes, Georgia Workshop now has a website. I've stepped into the 20th century. Hopefully next month I can actually move into the 21st century, who knows. But yeah, I'm going to have these up on the website. If there's enough demand, I may do a second run, may add in custom or more colors, possibly more styles, but I really like the Richardson style trucker hats. I'll probably stick with these for a while, but yeah, that's pretty much it for now. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.